But before I begin, I should start with two obvious caveats. First, as we say, there's a difference in life between a secret and a mystery. A secret is what people know, and we try very hard to find out. A mystery is what people don't know, and we cannot find out. The Middle East, perhaps more than many other places, have more mysteries than secrets, especially now and pertaining to the outcome of this war. So I think that should put in context, and we should have some humility as to try to predict what is going to happen. A second, as I was preparing for this conference, I thought very hard about the theme of this conference. And I think all of us in this room are hopeful that we can say very clearly the first part of today's theme. If you notice, today's theme is called After the Iran War. Excuse me. I'm not sure any one of us can decisively say at which point in the spectrum we are on now. Is this the beginning of the end, as some optimists would like to believe? Or is this the end of the beginning, as some who are more cautious would like to say? Or is this neither the beginning nor the end, as the people from the School of Hard Knocks will say? Because history, in many parts of the world, seldom travel in a linear direction. Very often, and perhaps more so in the Middle East than elsewhere, they travel in a spiral. So I leave it to you to decide which of these three markers we are closer to, whether we are at the beginning of the end of the beginning, or neither the beginning nor the end. I think many of you will probably agree with me that the third is more probable than the first. Now with that, with those caveats out of the way, allow me to just lay out a simple framework for discussion on three levels of impact. And these three levels of impact need not be determined, if you like, by the end of the war, because the impact is already here and now. And let me also say that these frameworks help us to think through the impact, not only about the Iran war, but also other ongoing conflicts in Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, Gaza. First, we can take a look at the impact on economics, supply chain, and investments. Second, we can look at the implications on international norms and rules. Third, we can look at the longer-term and wider consequences on the global order. So let me start with the first. The most obvious and immediate impact has been on the global economy, prices, and supply chains. We are all familiar with the price shocks across a range of commodities, from fuel to various downstream products. I won't belabor this point today. Prices may revert back to previous May, but certainly not likely in the short term. Much depends on any agreement that may come about, and if these agreements can hold. Even if prices gradually revert to pre-war ranges, I think the world will know that we now need to factor in a new risk premium that cannot be unwind or ignored. Now, beyond the short-term price changes, of greater concern will be the medium-term shifts in investment sentiments for our global economy. The heightened uncertainties will deal another negative blow to global investor confidence, which will have medium to long-term consequences on our global economy, job creation, and wage growth. Beyond the growth and size of the global economy will be the shape and form of the global economy as global businesses reassess their risk appetite and investment strategies. And more importantly, how they will reorganize their supply chains and production layout. There will be some new winners and losers as to be expected in all such shifts. For the Gulf region in particular, much depends on its ability to restore confidence in the global investment community. But for the global economy as a whole, these are not insurmountable adjustments. There will be difficult transitions. Some adjustments will be harder than others. Some countries will be more impacted than others. But government, businesses will adapt and adjust. This alone is unlikely to be fatal in the long term if the issue is largely a price-driven issue. What must be of greater concern should be the conflict's impact on the global rules that we collectively abide by. These include respect for international laws, such as the UNCLOS or United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and its binding provisions for transit passage through straits used for international navigation, including the Straits of Hormuz. Keeping our sea lanes open is not simply a matter of principled adherence to international law. It is in the enlightened self-interest of all stakeholders to do so, given that these waterways carry critical flows of trade, energy, and data. More than UNCLOS, the recent conflicts also impact global rules and norms beyond the maritime domain. They raise broader questions about the justification for war and the threshold for initiating one. The impulse to resort to force to resolve disputes reflect a worrying trend of a breakdown in diplomacy. If the world moves towards a fractured global order where might increasingly become right, the remnants of the rule-based order will be further eroded to all our detriment. All states will pay the price, even if we have done the least to cause it. As I said in the recent Shangri-La dialogue, it is always dangerous to throw the baby out with the bathwater. When international rules and norms do not work perfectly or always in our favor. But a world without rules and norms is the same as the traffic in a city. Chaos reigns, and we are all less safe. All having to expend our resources individually to secure our own security rather than to benefit from the collective good. Ultimately, growth, investments, and jobs are all impacted negatively. Now that brings me to the third set of implications, the longer-term implications for geopolitics in the Middle East and the global order. For decades, the international rules-based order was undergirded by major powers projecting their power and influence for the common good. However, in the recent conflicts beyond the Middle East, including, supposedly weaker actors have shown that they can hold up conventionally stronger ones through the use of asymmetric warfare means, including new, affordable, and scalable technologies like armed drones. We have also seen the weaponization of our hyper-connected economic supply chains and even the weaponization of geography to hold the world to ransom. Many states and non-states actors including those outside the Middle East, will be watching and taking note. Those who seek to capitalize on uncertainty to foment further instability and disruption to achieve their own objectives will certainly be cheered. If strategic deterrence by major powers is eroded, others might be tempted for greater aventurism. Such a transition is dangerous and challenging for everyone, including the big, medium, and small states. So with those sobering thoughts, I look forward to our discussion with you and to hear your views and perspective as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. And if I can take the opportunity to just continue the conversation with you with regards to the topic of the day. The ongoing discussions or the ongoing negotiations between the US and Iran, as we know, does not include Israel, certainly not directly. But there is discussion about whether or not the situation in southern Lebanon should be included in the discussions. And the Israelis have made it very clear that for their own national security perspective, that should not be part of the discussion. What are your thoughts on that? And in line with that also, the impediments that it would pose for the US and Iran to come to something more concrete, more long-term?
Well, the reality is that in the Middle East, it is a very complex region. Many issues are intertwined, not just from the geopolitical perspective, but also from the historical perspective. It is very hard to see a solution, if you like, to all the problems if we are not able to take a more holistic view of what is happening in the region. It is very hard to come to any peaceful settlement for the region unless all the stakeholders in the region have a shared interest to say that we want to set aside wars and conflicts and focus our energies on developing the economy and creating opportunities for our people. If any one party decide that my very existence cannot be taken for granted unless your very existence is diminished or extinguished, then I think we will be never able to find any solution. The fundamental issue is this: will people with diverse aspirations, complex history, come together and say that we want a fresh start? To set aside all the problems that we have from history till now and have a shared future together. Nobody has the solution to all the issues. But I think, as you have suggested, everyone has a veto vote. Everyone in the region has a veto vote. Which means that if someone feels that their interests are not secure, everyone and anyone can be a spoiler. And the conflict will be reunited in one way or the other. So, very fundamentally, if A thinks that I can only exist if B doesn't exist, or B thinks that I can only exist if A doesn't exist, then I think we will never have any solution to the issues. So you're right, and I agree with you, that the solutions beyond the current negotiations must be cast in a broader canvas of how the region wants to come together to take charge of its own destiny with a shared vision together. If not, then it's a zero-sum game.
Thank you, Minister. Maybe your thoughts, which you alluded to in your remarks about the international law and in particular the situation in the Straits of Hormuz. A lot of the discussions is about how Iran now has leverage, which it would probably be very reluctant and unwilling to relinquish. And that also has implications, again, as you suggested, for our wider understanding of international law with regards to international transit of straits, not just in the Straits of Hormuz. There's the Malacca Straits, even the Taiwan Straits, if you want to bring that into the picture. So can we hear your thoughts about the status of international law in that regard?
It's very interesting, because I think many of you will be familiar with the genesis of UNCLOS. There's a reason why UNCLOS and the rules within UNCLOS were crafted in such a way. The purpose of UNCLOS goes back all the way to the 1970s. Littoral states have certain rights in terms of where their territorial waters go up to, where their exclusive economic zone go up to. In return, littoral states also have the international obligations to allow the safe passage of vessels through those critical straits. This is the, if you like, the agreement, the consensus that the world come to, that this is all better for us. Because prior to that, it's not very clear who has the rights to do what across international waterways and who has the right to how much waters or otherwise. So after many years, if you say that this is my right and you forget that this is also my obligations, then we are back to the pre-UNCLOS days. And I think we will be all worse off. Some people might be tempted to say that, well, if I can collect, why don't I collect? So that I can weaponize or leverage geography to my advantage. But just remember, what goes round comes round. What one can collect in one part of the world, many people can collect in many parts of the world. And very soon, we will trying to raise ourselves to the bottom. And that is where the dangers will be.
Thank you, Minister. Maybe a final question, then I'll open it up to the floor. And this relates to energy security and Asia's future. So we know that certainly at the height of the conflict, there was concern about a global energy crisis. And that triggered a lot of discussion about whether or not the plans for energy transition in the region are going to accelerate, or are we going to fall back on coal, which is a short-term measure, but with obviously long-term implications for the climate agenda. So the question is whether you think we will be able to see a significant shift in the energy security equation in the region in the coming months and years?
Well, I would say this, regardless of the war in Ukraine or the war in Iran, the Middle East, the energy transition is something that we all have to take very seriously. The diversification and resilience of our energy supplies is something that we will take it very seriously, with or without the wars. I would argue that even without the wars and the conflicts, this does not make it any less urgent. For Southeast Asia, ASEAN in particular, there should be great impetus for us to come together and work on the regional grid in order for us to moderate the prices that we have to pay for energy, in order for us to secure the clean or cleaner, more sustainable energy that will be required to propel our future growth. The logic is very simple. In every country today, excuse me, we spend about 20% plus minus of our resources building spare capacities to cater for our respective contingencies in our own domestic energy supplies, distribution system. In ASEAN today, we do have renewables, and we do have many forms of energy, cleaner forms of energy. The question is, how do we build the regional grid where we can all benefit? I've always made this argument that for ASEAN to be fully seen as an integrated, attractive economic proposition, we have to get three things to be much more integrated: data, finance, and energy. If we can connect up our grids, there's literally what we call money on the table for everyone. But having said that, there's this joke that goes around, right? If only economists run the world, we will all be a happier place. This coming from a student who studied economics rather than politics. So the question is, will the politics triumph or will the economics triumph? You talk to all the businesses out there, everybody wants cheaper energy, everybody wants a more resilient supply, everybody wants to see the governments being able to overcome the political barriers domestically for a more integrated ASEAN power grid. And I will make this argument, more so for Singapore, but not much less for the rest of the region. In Singapore, for the last 50 years, water was our defining challenge. For Singapore, in the next 50 years, energy will be our defining challenge. If we have cleaner, sustainable, reliable sources of energy, we need not worry about water because we have the technology to do so. And if we have cleaner, more sustainable, more reliable energy sources, then we will also be able to compete in the new economy where it's going to be very energy intensive, including all the data centers, compute power, AI-related industries that we all need. So the arguments are obvious and clear that we all want a more reliable, more affordable, more sustainable energy grid in ASEAN. Then the question for us is, can we work together to overcome some of the near-term political challenges and for us to all enjoy the benefits of this more integrated grid? And this effort must continue regardless whether we think there is a war or there's not a war. It's very tempting to forget such lessons once the immediate conflict is over. But this is not something that I think will be with us for the short term. This is a long-term challenge, and we need a long-term response to build our more integrated ASEAN grid.
Okay, I would like to now open the discussion to the floor. But before I do that, first, I want to welcome our attendees from online as well, those of you who are dialing in. And we also welcome you to register your questions. If you can just type it out in the chat box. What I'll do is I'll take a few questions from people in the room, and then we will shift to online and then shift back to the room. So to the room, can I invite your questions? I would ask that you identify yourself and the organization you're from, and if you can keep your questions as short as possible, that will be much appreciated. The first question, please. Shin Kwok.
Choi Shin Kwok from the ICC Sovichak Institute. Thank you very much, Minister, for bringing us back to the history of UNCLOS. My question to you actually also pertains to that. During the UNCLOS negotiations in the 1970s, we don't have the technologies we have today, like submarine cables, underwater drones, which nobody can really detect. Do you see that there's a way forward for UNCLOS to be updated? And how essential is this for the future of actually the whole of trade and of mankind? Of course, data you mentioned is similarly dependent on that. The other kind of question I'd like to pose to you is just to take up the analogy you gave. You said that if we, we didn't have rules, it's going to be like traffic in a city that doesn't have any rules. And we know very well, actually, in ASEAN, there are some cities, some regions, where there may be some traffic infrastructure, but actually nobody follows them. And somehow the people kind of, they don't get into so many accidents as you would expect. So do you see that as we go forward, as far as international law is concerned, if there are some countries that are not going to be observing these rules, will the world adjust? And do you see that if they were to adjust, what kind of configuration do you think would, if you would extend that analogy a bit? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Shin Kwok, for the two sets of issues. Should we update UNCLOS? Certainly. Because when UNCLOS was conceived, I think our major preoccupation was how to keep the trade flowing and how to make sure that different countries have rights that are fairly accounted for across the world, whether it's fishing rights, mining rights, and so forth. But as you have rightly pointed out, two things have become more salient since then. First, the critical waterways in the world today don't just carry trade. They also carry electrons and data. So increasingly, the world is connected by all these undersea cables for data, and increasingly, I think we will also see the world being connected up with undersea cables for electrons or energy. And what are the rules for this? And this is why, during Shangri-La Dialogue, Singapore made a contribution to try to gather like-minded countries to come together to think about this issue. How do we have new rules building upon the foundation of UNCLOS that allows us to have clear rules on how do we build, maintain all these critical underwater infrastructures? And today, any attack on such infrastructure, any attack on one part of the infrastructure is an attack on the network. And that's why we have a shared and common interest to work together to deter and to prevent such things from happening. So, from our perspective, I think we need to sit down and talk about some of these new issues, besides managing the existing ones that we have to manage. On your second issue, I'm not exactly, I won't characterize as some cities not having traffic rules. They may not have the traffic rules that we have in Singapore. But having lived in different cities, I think I would say that every city has its social norms. It's just that sometimes the Singaporean visiting may not understand other people's social norms, and we think that there are no rules. There are some cities, there are some rules that Singaporeans don't very well understand. Like, for example, when there's no traffic light and you cross the road, try not to make eye contact. Just kidding. That itself is a social norm. In some cities, where it seems to have no rules, but there's an implicit rule. I've been to one, whereby whenever a traffic accident happens, there's only the following rules. The fast must take care of the slow. The big must take care of the small. It's not the same as who has the right of way, whether you turn left or right. No, but they have social norms. So what I'm saying is that you may not have the rules that Singapore have, but I think they certainly have social norms. Now, so that an extension to that, I will make just 2 points. Maybe the kind of rules that we are very used to in Singapore, they are rather efficient, they are very clear, easy to understand, and there are some merits to that because it lower what we in economics we call the transaction costs. Things are predictable. The thing about rules is that they help to lower transaction costs. It makes lives a bit more predictable. It makes people more willing to go out and do business and so forth. But if you don't have all these rules, there will be other norms. And the different norms will evolve for different cities or different regions to drive that analogy. But it doesn't mean that there are no rules. There are still some norms that people can do business in a more predictable way. My sense, coming previously from MTI, is whether prices are high and low is not the be-all and end-all. It's whether prices are predictable, whether transaction costs are predictable. So people say that, no, sometimes outside Singapore, you have to pay a lot of fees of all kinds. But businessmen know how to get around it, so long as the fees are predictable. There's this famous saying, corruption is bad. Unpredictable corruption is worse. So I don't know whether there's such a thing called predictable corruption, but anyway. So I think, if you want to use an analogy, I think whether you call it rules or norms, they are all here to help all of us to live a more predictable environment so that we can make decisions. What I think worries us a lot is that when there are no rules, no norms, people hesitate to make decisions. And when you don't make decisions to invest today, the consequences are not felt here and now, but you'll be felt downstream. So if you like, the growth trajectory will take a different turn rather than suffering a blip and come back to the same. So it's the level of uncertainty that I think we are trying to deal with rather than a stochastic event that happens. I don't know whether that makes sense to you. I think every society has certain norms, right? In traffic. You learn to cross the road differently in different cities. I don't know, I learned to figure that when I live in Jakarta, it's quite different from when I live in Singapore. In Singapore, people cross the road by looking at their phone.
Okay, we can move on to the next question. There's one online, and the question is, what could the change reality mean for Singapore? I suppose you mean the situation unfolding in the Middle East. The US has lost a lot of credibility in the current process. Can the US be relied to provide a security umbrella for the region? How is China expected to respond? This looks like a lecture in itself.
Yes, this looks like a lecture in itself. But before, I hope not to go into a lecture, but can I just make the following points? First, this statement that the US has lost a lot of credibility in the current process, I think there is something for the historians to decide in due course. I think it will be rather unwise for us to jump to certain short-term conclusions. So that's my first point. Second, I think, and I've said this many times at Shangri-La and before, all of us have to pull our own weight for our own defense. I don't know about others, but in Singapore, we never make the assumption that somebody will come and save our skin if anything goes wrong. We believe that if we want to be the masters of our destiny, we have to take responsibility for it. And that's why we consistently invested in our defense and will continue to do so not just in terms of budget, but in terms of the allocation of manpower, talent, and time from our entire population. And I think that remains a wise decision. We have to pull our own weight. How the rest of the world respond, I think it's not whether some people say that who has gotten more credibility and who has gotten less credibility that matters most. Sometimes it is the perception and the calculation that matters most. And that was why I said in my third point just now. Whether you think A or B has become stronger or weaker in the process, that's just our perception. But what is more important to prevent future incidents and accidents is what other people think. Because if we miscalculate, or if other people miscalculate, then I think we are in for trouble. The biggest danger in the world of security is not just about capabilities. It's about intentions and whether people read the intentions correctly. Sometimes nothing might have changed, but because perception have changed and people think that A or B has become less effective, then people change their calculations and that becomes dangerous. So I won't comment on whether the statement there is right or wrong, that the historians can go and debate for it. What I will say is perceptions of intentions, perceptions of capabilities sometimes matter even more than the capability and intention itself. And that's why when the world is in flux and people are not clear about each other's intention, it is a dangerous world. Or people miscalculate each other's intention or capabilities and or capabilities. It is a dangerous world. And today, we are in a dangerous world.
Maybe if I can push you a bit on that second part of the question, China's response. But I would ask you to just share your thoughts on whether or not you see China playing a role in what is evolving in the Middle East, whether they can play a more proactive role there, or whether they want to do that.
I really don't know what the world expects of China in the Middle East. If I'm a Chinese, the answer is quite clear, right? What are my interests in the Middle East? How do I secure my interests in the Middle East? Anything beyond that, I'm not about to expand my capabilities nor political capital to solve problems which are beyond me. I think, to be fair, it's not only China that does that. I think every country does that, right? There are very few countries in history that expand their political capital beyond what is necessary to secure their self-interest. I say very few. I don't mean zero. But I think the operating assumption for most is that I will do what's necessary to secure my interests and not more. So if we understand what's China's interest, then I think we can expect China to do what is necessary for its interests.
Okay, we can return back to the room. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, Minister. Thank you so much for your insights. I'm Isaac from Singtel. I noticed you talked a lot about energy as the future for the next 50 years, as well as how Singapore historically has Singapore's strategy has been to create value by connecting countries that may not always agree politically. I think the question I'm going to ask is regards to energy infrastructure as well as digital infrastructure, these are the things that are up and coming as well as things that are currently present. Do you think that, let's say, energy infrastructure, if it's coming up in the next 50 years, do you think it'll be harder or easier to govern than digital infrastructure currently?
Both are hard.
Yeah.
The only easy day we had was yesterday.
That's true.
So I'm not sure what you meant by harder, or I think there's only harder, hardest, right? I never thought anything was easy. So I'm not exactly sure what you mean by which one is harder.
I mean,
both has its different challenges.
Yeah. I think to clarify, I meant, do you feel that energy infrastructure requires a lot more political governance, like in regards to connecting different countries, like landing points and things like that?
Well, both are hard in their different ways. Information infrastructure must operate in a network, so it does require people to work together. Energy infrastructure, we may think that we can operate in isolation, but I've just mentioned, I think it is wiser for us to have some connectivity so that we can all benefit from the, if you like, the technical term is called load balancing, right? From renewables to people with less renewables, to those people with different search requirements, to those with other patterns of search requirements. So I think they are difficult in different ways, but not insurmountable if we put our minds to it.
And just a last follow-up question. So do you feel that, you mentioned a little bit about the ASEAN grid, right? Do you feel that this is something that will happen in maybe the next 10 years, or do you think it might take longer than that?
I won't be able to put a timeline to such things, but we certainly, from Singapore's perspective, we certainly do what we can to encourage for everyone to see the benefits of working together. Of course, everything in Singapore, we hope that it happened yesterday, but we are realistic that there are different jurisdictions have different domestic challenges that they have to overcome.
Thank you
But
so much.
for us, I think it's important to understand what are people's domestic challenges, what are people's political challenges. Don't assume that every country works like Singapore. And then we work with the other stakeholders to see how we can overcome those challenges together. And that's just being realistic. So hope is not a method. But it's,
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. There was a question here. Yeah, can you make a way to the mic? Thanks.
Martin Wilhelm, Geopolitics Energy. You described the Middle Eastern security dilemma basically as, to guarantee my own security, I need to diminish or undermine yours, otherwise mine is not secure. So historically, would you say that looking at the history of the region and this region, Southeast Asia, and the different cultures, you could have ended up in a similar place, but you clearly didn't. So from that experience, would you say there's anything players in the Middle East could benefit from looking at the history of Southeast Asia and how they avoided that sharp security dilemma? And to make the question a little more practical, do you see any ideas from how you would look at that question for policy schools or diplomacy schools in the Middle East, or in Singapore rather, to collaborate on with their colleagues in the Middle East?
first, I think I should be more circumspect, and it's not my. I don't think I'm suggesting that the Middle East try to learn anything from Southeast Asia. I don't think that's the spirit of it. I think the Middle East has its own challenges, has its own history, and we should respect and understand that. So how the Middle East country comes to their own solutions will be quite different from how perhaps Southeast Asian countries come to their own solutions, because the history is different, the context is different. So I'm not saying that one should try to copy what other people do. By the way, I think in Southeast Asia, we have our own fair share of challenges. It's not as if that we are living in Shangri-La and then there are no issues. But I think what is fundamental, whether it's in the Middle East, the Southeast Asia, I think what is fundamental is this. Do the people in the neighborhood want to come together and say, let's prosper thy neighbor? Let's work together. For the good of our people, what are we fighting for? What are we fighting for? What are we fighting for? Is it to put down somebody else? Is it to make sure that we lift our people up? It is an age-old security issue. That's why I say what I say at Shangri-La as well. One cannot hope to improve my own sense of security without addressing other people's insecurity. Because it becomes a vicious cycle, right? Everybody try to arm themselves, to feel themselves, to make themselves more secure. In the end, making their neighbors feel less secure. And every action has a reaction, equal and opposite in direction, according to Newton's third law. Then we are in a race to the bottom. But fundamentally, whether it's Middle East or Southeast Asia, is this. Do we come together and say that we can uplift one another? And our competition is not amongst us or between any particular country. Our real competition is how do we create a value proposition, make a living for ourselves and our people with the rest of the world. Now that is fundamental. If we cannot set aside that, never mind whether it is Southeast Asia or Middle East, we'll get back into the same problem. It's the same in Africa, it's the same in South America, it's the same everywhere. Where people say that, I want to prosper, I want to be more secure, but I decide to go it alone, then I cause externalities on others. What is more complicated in the Middle East, perhaps more so than Southeast Asia, is history. It's history. We have a saying, never forget history, but never be shackled by history. That requires leadership. How do we transcend history? That will require very bold leadership. From the countries in Middle East to the countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, or South America. That we want to transcend history. We don't want to be shackled by history. We can see a shared future working together, prospering together, where it's not a zero-sum game. Well, I'm not entirely despondent. I think some Gulf countries have been able to show that. Qatar, the UAE, they are trying to transcend history and not be shackled by history. If that is the starting point, and that's a shared starting point, then I think the people in the Middle East or elsewhere, Southeast Asia, we will all have a much better life. Because we are focused on what is really important to the people, rather than what's important to a select group of people who are there thinking about their political interests and so forth. Frankly speaking, if you ask the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Iranians, the Saudis, the average people on the street, what do they want? They just want to be able to get on with life. Have some peace, some predictability, able to trade with one another. That's all right. We are all quite simple. You ask the people in Southeast Asia, what do we want? The common people on the streets are not fighting all these political issues, right? They just want to be able to find a good job, be able to trade, be able to take care of their families. And as political leaders, we have to ask ourselves, is that not our responsibility to try to deliver that? And my final thought is this. I think one more. At the end of the day, what is victory for any countries in the Middle East or Southeast Asia? What is victory? Is victory because we managed to beat the other guy? Bash him up? Is victory because I've been able to trump and beat him and become richer than him and so forth? Is that real victory? Or is victory where you are able to hold ourselves up as a beacon to attract people to say that, I want to be like you. I want to be like you. So I always say this, including to big powers. History is not when you defeat the other fella. History is when you win the war. When you win the war and the world says that, I think this is the model that I want to be. That to me is victory. It's not about beating your opponent, but it's about winning the war. It's very idealistic perhaps, but I think, well, at least with some ideals, life is worth trying, even though life is hard. But at least there's something I think we can strive towards, right? But I'm not sure this mindset is so common that we want to prosper thy neighbor together and not beggar thy neighbor. But this is ultimately an issue of political leadership. All of us have a choice to make. All of us have a responsibility to take. So I don't think there's anything unique about the situation in Southeast Asia or the Middle East or Africa or South America. The question is an issue of political leadership. Whether we really want to transcend history, uplift our people, rather than just focus on beating the other guy.